Under the dim light of a fading sky, the whispers of an old curse lingered in the wind, carried from one trembling lip to another. They spoke of a woman too tall, too strong, too much for any man to endure, a bride whose touch was said to end in death before dawn. Astrid stood at the edge of the churchyard, her figure rising like a mountain against the horizon, shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of storms, hands powerful enough to bend iron without thought. Around her neck hung 3 rings, not as adornments, but as gravestones, each one a silent testimony to the men who had dared to love her and had not lived to tell the tale. The townsfolk gathered in uneasy clusters, their eyes shifting between fear and curiosity, their voices lowering whenever she turned her glacial gaze upon them. And yet, beneath the legends of danger and doom, there was something the crowd never noticed. The way her calloused fingers trembled when they brushed against the petals of the fresh flowers she laid on 3 lonely graves. The quiet fracture in her voice when she whispered the names of those who had once called her wife. Strength had become her prison, and loneliness her only companion. She had been carved by labor, by survival, by a world that saw her sighs as curse rather than gift. Her laughter had died the night her first husband smiled into eternity, and since then her days had been filled with silence, broken only by the wind through the grass. The world said no man could survive her, and she had begun to believe it, a truth sharper than any blade. But then came Thomas Wade. Scarred by battles of his own, carrying grief that had turned his heart into stone, he looked at Astrid not as a monster, but as a woman cloaked in sorrow. He did not flinch at the graves behind the chapel, nor at the stories of shattered ribs and broken hearts. He did not step back when her shadow fell over him. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to hers as if he were grasping the very edge of life itself. The people laughed, they whispered, they wagered against him. The undertaker had already prepared the headstone. But Thomas, with his sunburned skin and storm-grey eyes, smiled as though death no longer frightened him. He had known bullets, fire, lightning, and loss greater than most men could carry, and yet he chose this path willingly. Perhaps he was reckless, perhaps broken, or perhaps he understood something no one else did, that love, no matter how impossible, was worth the risk of everything. As the preacher raised his trembling voice to begin the vows, the storm clouds gathered above, dark and heavy, like the judgment of heaven itself. The wind howled, rattling the wooden crosses of the cemetery, and the world seemed to hold its breath. When Astrid bent low and Thomas rose high on his toes, their lips met in a kiss that defied fear, defied legend, defied death. For a fleeting heartbeat, the earth felt steady, the sky paused, and in the balance between terror and tenderness, something healing stirred, fragile but real. This was not the end of her curse, nor the end of his grief. It was the beginning of something neither of them yet understood, a journey through storms both outside and within, where strength would be tested, where surrender would be the bravest act of all, and where 2 broken souls might discover that love, even impossible love, could be a light in the darkest night. And if this story moves something inside you, if it makes you wonder about the power of love to heal what the world calls too much, let your heart whisper back. Like, comment, and subscribe, not for me, but to keep alive the reminder that stories of love in all their impossible forms are worth keeping close. For every heart deserves to know that somewhere, somehow, being too much can be exactly enough. And so, under the weight of storm clouds and whispered curses, the tale begins, of a giant bride and the man who dared to say, "Just try me and see." The night stretched long, heavy with the promise of storm and the restless murmur of the crowd that trailed behind them at a distance. Each footstep Thomas took beside Astrid felt like a vow whispered against the thunderclouds gathering overhead. He was a man smaller than her shadow, yet he walked with a steadiness that drew the eye, a calm that seemed almost defiant in the face of the wagered deaths and whispered predictions of doom. Astrid's wedding dress, stitched and let out until fabrics strained against her strength, brushed against the dust of the road as though even the earth bowed beneath her. She could have ridden, but pride kept her tall, stride for stride with the man who chose to take her hand. He felt the weight of her palm in his, large, rough, trembling, not from weakness but from restraint. She glanced sideways at him more than once, searching for hesitation, waiting for the flinch that had always come when men realized what she truly was. But Thomas held on. His thumb traced circles over her calluses as if reading scripture etched into her skin, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to feel something soft bloom through the cracks of her fear. Healing did not always come like sunlight. Sometimes it came like rain, quiet and steady, sinking deep into the soil of the soul. "Why me?" she asked at last, her voice breaking through the creak of wagon wheels and the murmur of distant thunder. "So many men in town, yet you answered. Why?" The words carried both suspicion and longing, the ache of a woman who had learned that her truth often repelled more than it invited. Thomas breathed in the storm air before answering, his gaze fixed not on her towering frame but on the horizon. "Because your words were the only honest ones I had read in years. You did not pretend to be delicate. You did not lie about who you are. You said you needed a partner, not a pet. I've been walking through life like a ghost, Astrid. Empty. I wanted to feel again, even if it meant walking into fire. And when I saw you, lifting that barrel of molasses like it weighed nothing, I felt something for the first time in 10 years. Fear, envy, awe. But above all, hope. Hope. The word struck her like a prayer, like balm poured into an unhealed wound. For so long she had believed she was cursed to destroy what she touched, to bring only endings. And here was a man who called her beginning. His voice carried no tremor, no hesitation, only the quiet conviction of someone who had survived loss so complete that even death could not scare him any more. Astrid's steps faltered, and she looked at him as though seeing a stranger wrapped in the body of a man who had known fire, bullets, lightning, and still chose to stand by her side. When they reached the small ranch house, rain began to fall, cold drops striking against her shoulders, but doing nothing to soften her stature. The cabin looked fragile against her presence, a world too small to contain her, and yet Thomas had prepared it with care. A reinforced bed waited within, iron brackets and a mattress thick enough to hold a weight most would not dare to imagine. It was not a cage, but a gift, an act of faith that she might finally have a place where she did not need to break everything she touched. Inside, the lamplight trembled against the walls. Astrid wrapped her arms around herself, fighting the memories of 3 men who had smiled and then gone still, whose bodies had broken under the force of her love. 3 men, she whispered, her voice raw. 3 good men who wanted me, and I buried them all. The words carried more than confession. They carried the loneliness of a lifetime, the sorrow of someone who had forgotten the sound of her own laughter. Thomas unbuttoned his shirt slowly, revealing a map of scars, each mark a testimony of survival against the unforgiving hand of fate. "Every wound on this body should have killed me," he murmured, "but I lived. Perhaps I survived all that, only to arrive here with you. You think your strength is a curse?" "I think it is the only thing in this world strong enough to reach me where I've been buried." His words sank into her like healing rain, unsettling and soothing all at once, a reminder that maybe love was not meant to be gentle, it was meant to be true. She shivered, not from fear, but from the dawning realization that this man did not ask her to be less. He did not want her to shrink herself into something the world could accept. He wanted her as she was, vast, powerful, dangerous, alive. When she warned him of what her body became in the grip of passion, of the violence that lived in her love, he only smiled. "Who said anything about gentle?" he whispered. And in that fragile space between thunder and silence, between fear and surrender, Astrid felt something break, not in him, but in herself. For the first time, the chains of her guilt loosened. For the first time, she thought that maybe, just maybe, love was not a death sentence, but a healing path forward. The storm outside raged like a warning, but within the walls of that small cabin, a different storm was gathering, one born not of destruction, but of a chance to finally live again. And as the thunder rolled across the prairie, the night opened its arms to them, carrying them toward the next chapter of their impossible story. The storm did not let up that night. It battered the walls of the little cabin as if the world outside was determined to test them both before dawn. Lightning split the sky, white fire pouring across the prairie, and thunder rolled like drums of war, yet inside the lamplit room there was a different kind of battle being waged, one of surrender, one of fragile hope daring to bloom in the ruins of fear. Astrid stood in the middle of the cabin, her massive frame shivering as though she were the smallest creature alive. Her hands twisted together, strong enough to bend iron, but too afraid to touch the man who now sat calmly on the edge of the reinforced bed. She whispered into the storm, "You don't understand. When the moment comes, I can't control it. My body doesn't know how to be gentle." Thomas rose from the bed slowly, not rushing her, each movement deliberate, steady, like a man soothing a wild horse that has known too much cruelty. He crossed the creaking floorboards until he stood before her, so small in comparison that his hand against her cheek looked like a child's. But his eyes, storm-grey and unwavering, held her with a strength no size could measure. "I don't want gentle, Astrid," he said softly. "Gentle never saved me. What I want is you, exactly as you are. I've been a ghost for 10 years, and ghosts are not afraid of dying. They're afraid of never having lived." Her breath caught, the words striking deeper than any blade, loosening the chains she had wrapped around her own soul. Tears pricked her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she lowered her head, lips trembling, as if uncertain whether to kiss or to flee. And Thomas, with the patience of a man who had walked side by side with death too many times, lifted his face to hers. The kiss that followed was nothing like the measured touch at the church. It was storm and fire. It was the cry of the earth for rain. It was everything she had held back for years exploding into the space between them. Her strength surged like floodwater, fierce and unrestrained, But Thomas did not shatter. He bent, he flowed, he survived, his body yielding not in defeat, but in welcome. When at last they pulled apart, both gasping for breath, Astrid's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're still standing," she whispered, half in wonder, half in terror. "Disappointed?" he teased, and for the first time since the first husband's death, her laughter broke free, a sound rich and rolling, shaking the rafters and scattering the dust of sorrow from the corners of the room. The storm outside thundered as if in applause, and Thomas smiled at the echo of life returning to a woman who had long thought herself a curse. The night unfolded with no more hesitation. They moved together like two broken rivers, finally meeting, colliding, carving a new course through the barren land of grief. The bed groaned, the house shuddered, but nothing collapsed. Her hands, though strong enough to snap wood, found steadiness against his scars. His body, though small against hers, met her with a resilience born of long years of pain. Every bruise she left on him was not destruction, but proof that he was alive, that they both were. Healing sometimes came with marks, reminders that love was not about avoiding pain, but surviving through it, growing stronger because of it. When dawn broke, pink and gold filtered through rain-washed windows, Thomas lay awake, his heart still beating, steady and strong. Beside him, Astrid's great form filled 3/4 of the bed, her breathing uneven, disbelief etched into her every sigh. She touched his chest again and again, as if she could not trust her eyes, whispering, "You're alive." And each time he answered with the same warm half-smile, "Disappointed?" Until tears finally slipped down her cheeks, not of grief, but of release. She rose, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, ashamed of the broken chair, the cracked headboard, the splintered floorboards, all wreckage of her love too fierce to control. "I broke your house," she said miserably. Thomas reached for her, his voice low but sure. "No, you broke my coffin. There's a difference." She froze, the words like a key turning in a lock inside her heart, unlocking something long buried. For the first time, she believed that maybe she was not too much for the world. Maybe she was exactly what someone had been waiting for. A knock at the door shattered the quiet. Voices outside, urgent, demanding to know if Thomas still breathed. The doctor, the preacher, the undertaker, all waiting with their doubts and wagers. Thomas pulled on his pants, opened the door just enough for the lamplight to spill onto his face, and said evenly, "As you can see, Doctor, I'm still breathing." The astonishment in their eyes was almost comical, and when Thomas closed the door again, he turned to Astrid with a smile that stripped 10 years from his worn features. "Let them wait. Let them whisper. We have more important things to do than prove them wrong." Astrid stood by the window, her silhouette immense against the fading storm. She had expected tragedy. She had expected another grave to tend. Instead, she felt something she had not dared hope for in years, healing warmth spreading through her chest, fragile but alive. She turned back to him, eyes shining, and for the first time whispered words that did not taste of sorrow. Maybe we can begin again." And Thomas, his hand reaching for hers, answered not with words, but with the kind of smile that told her everything. That the ghost had finally found reason to live, that the giant had finally found someone who would not break, and that together they were about to discover what love beyond fear truly meant. Morning poured itself across the prairie in gold and rose, the storm's memory still clinging to the air, heavy with the scent of wet earth. Inside the cabin, the hush of new beginnings lingered, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath for what had survived the night. Astrid sat at the small wooden table, a blanket wrapped around her broad shoulders, staring at her hands as though they were foreign things. Hands that had carried sacks heavier than most men, hands that had broken bones without meaning to, hands that had dug graves with trembling fingers when all she had wanted was to cradle life. She flexed them slowly, as though expecting to see death in her palms, but instead she felt warmth, a strange, trembling joy that both frightened and soothed her. Thomas moved quietly around the cabin, frying bacon, stirring eggs, pouring coffee with a grace that seemed at odds with his scarred, battle-shaped body. He moved with the ease of a man who had finally remembered what it meant to belong somewhere. Every sound of his cooking was domestic, ordinary, grounding, as though he were weaving a new rhythm into the fragile silence they now shared. He set a plate before her, portions generous enough for her towering strength, and said simply, "Fuel for the day. That body of yours is like a steam engine. It needs feeding." His tone carried no jest, no judgment, only care. Astrid blinked at the plate, as though surprised anyone had thought to nourish her in this way. Slowly, cautiously, she began to eat, careful not to crush the fork between her fingers. She glanced at him across the table, confusion furrowing her brow. "Why aren't you dead, Thomas? Really? The others?" Her voice faltered, memory choking her. "Henrik was a blacksmith, strong as an ox, thought he could endure me. He died smiling, but his heart shattered in my arms. Eric, bigger still, a farmer whose chest broke like a drum splitting in half. And Samuel, sweet Samuel, gentle as spring rain, small like you. I thought gentleness would save him, but even then my hands crushed 3 of his ribs. I buried them all. And yet you sit here as if the night was nothing." Thomas did not flinch. He set down his fork, leaned forward, and met her eyes with quiet steadiness. "You ever see a river in flood?" She nodded slowly. "Trees that try to stand rigid, they snap. But the reeds and the grass, they bend, flow with the water, and when it passes, they rise again. That's what last night was. I didn't fight you. I let the storm take me. I bent and I survived." Her hand tightened on the table's edge, wood groaning in protest. She loosened her grip quickly, shame flashing in her eyes. "I could have killed you." "But you didn't," he answered softly. "And tonight you won't either. Because strength isn't your curse, Astrid. It's just strength. And I've lived long enough to know that surviving has less to do with muscle and more to do with spirit." For a long moment, silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the steady breath of 2 souls learning how to exist side by side. Astrid's eyes softened as she studied him. This man who had endured wars, loss and despair, yet spoke to her as though she were not too much, but exactly enough. A warmth unfurled in her chest, hesitant and healing, like the first green shoot after winter. Thomas stood, circled the table, and with quiet boldness climbed onto her lap as though he belonged there. Astrid froze, every muscle locking, terrified of moving, terrified of breaking him. But he cupped her face in his hands, kissed her softly, deliberately, and whispered, "Last night proved something. You're not cursed, and I'm not dead. We're both more alive than we've been in years." Her heart hammered in her chest like a drum too big for its cage, yet for once she did not resist it. She allowed herself to believe, if only for this moment, that love could be more than sorrow and loss, that love could be healing. She drew him closer, and his laughter, unexpected, warm, boyish, spilled into the small cabin like sunlight after endless rain. It was a sound that stitched something broken inside her, that told her perhaps she had not been born only to destroy, but also to mend. Outside, the prairie still held the marks of last night's storm, but within those fragile walls something gentler took root. Not fragile in weakness, but fragile in its preciousness, a thing to be guarded, nurtured, protected. Astrid, who had carried the weight of her strength like a shackle, now carried something else entirely, the first fragile hope that she could be loved, not despite her power, but because of it. And as the sun climbed higher, pouring gold over the drenched land, Astrid and Thomas looked at each other across the small space between them and saw not curses, not ghosts, not impossible odds, but the beginning of a life they might finally dare to build together, brick by brick, heartbeat by heartbeat, healing where once there had only been fear. Days slipped into weeks, as though time itself wished to give them space, and the prairie around the ranch bore silent witness to the transformation taking place within its modest walls. Where once there had been silence thick with grief, laughter began to ripple through the cabin. Astrid, who had lived for so long believing her hands could only bury, now found them shaping a life, hauling timber, repairing fences, kneading bread with careful strength. Each task carried its own tenderness, as though she were teaching herself to live again. Thomas, whose spirit had wandered in shadows, moved with new purpose, his small frame carrying burdens of joy heavier than any saddle. Together they rebuilt more than fences and walls. They rebuilt the fragile scaffolding of hope, one healing act at a time. The ranch began to thrive under their shared labor. Astrid pulled stumps from the earth that had resisted Thomas for years, her muscles straining not with violence but with creation. She carried barrels of water 2 at a time, while he steadied the beams she raised, his hands quick with repairs, his mind patient with detail. They worked like 2 mismatched gears that somehow meshed perfectly, creating motion where there had been stillness. And in those rhythms of sweat and soil, Astrid felt the weight of her curse begin to shift, transforming from a chain into something like wings. The town, however, watched with suspicion. Every Sunday after church, curious eyes found excuses to ride past the ranch. They saw Astrid towering in the fields, her laughter echoing across the plains as she lifted bales with ease. They saw Thomas, smaller but alive in a way he hadn't been in a decade, his posture straighter, his voice lighter, his smile reborn. Whispers filled the saloon, words like unnatural and bewitched, spoken with the bitterness of men who had never known a love strong enough to frighten them. The mayor, in particular, fumed with jealousy, watching a ranch he had planned to swallow up flourish instead under hands that worked in harmony. To him, their happiness was a threat, proof that love could grow in soil he had declared barren. But inside the cabin, those whispers could not pierce the healing warmth being woven. At night, Astrid would sit in the rocking chair Thomas had reinforced, knitting clumsy stitches with needles forged from railway spikes. She bent them often, her strength uncontainable. Yet Thomas only smiled, straightened them again, and placed the yarn back in her hands. "You're practicing gentleness," he would say, and in those words she heard not mockery, but admiration. Sometimes he would climb into her lap as though he belonged there, his weight small but his presence vast, whispering stories of battles survived and ghosts laid to rest. She would listen, her enormous hands trembling against him, and in those quiet hours she discovered a healing she had never thought possible, to hold without breaking, to love without killing. One evening, as the sky burned red over the prairie, Astrid stood watching the horizon while Thomas stacked firewood. "They'll never stop watching us," she murmured, her voice carrying both defiance and weariness. "Waiting for you to die. Waiting for me to prove them right." Thomas leaned on the axe handle, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let them wait," he said. "They'll grow old before I do, and by then they'll see what I already know, that you're not a curse, Astrid. You're the only thing that ever brought me back to life." Her breath trembled, a laugh and a sob tangled together, and she turned away so he would not see the tears she could no longer hold back. But Thomas did see. He crossed the yard, touched her hand with fingers that felt impossibly small against her skin, and held on. His grip was steady, unafraid, reminding her that even storms pass, leaving the land fresher, greener, more alive. That night they lay together beneath the lamplight, the shadows of their mismatched bodies curling into one. Astrid pressed her ear against his chest, listening to the steady drumbeat that so many had sworn would fail. Each heartbeat was a miracle, each breath proof that love could be survived, even when it came wrapped in impossible strength. She whispered into his scars, "Maybe I am not too much." And he, with a soft laugh that warmed her to her bones, replied, "Maybe you are exactly enough." Beyond the cabin walls, jealousy and suspicion grew like weeds in the hearts of those who could not understand. But within, love bloomed wild and untamed, turning grief into laughter, fear into tenderness, and strength into healing. And though storms still gathered on the horizon, Astrid and Thomas had already chosen their path. To walk it together, unshaken, one heartbeat at a time, until the world itself learned to bend and flow with them. The prairie never stayed silent for long. Word of the ranch's unlikely revival spread, but so too did envy, carried on the breath of men who could not bear to see joy where they had predicted ruin. In the corners of the saloon, voices muttered that no man should live beneath the roof of such a woman, that no ranch could be built on the back of something so unnatural. The mayor's voice rose above the rest, declaring that Thomas Wade had been bewitched, that Astrid was no wife, but a curse draped in human skin. Jealousy sharpened his words, for he had once set his eyes on Thomas's land, waiting for it to wither into cheap inheritance. Now, under Astrid's strength and Thomas's steadiness, the ranch thrived. Cattle fattened, fences stood straighter, water flowed clear, and for the first time in years, Thomas laughed in public. That laughter alone was enough to stir hatred in those who had built their power on misery. Astrid felt the tension before she heard it. Horses shifting uneasily on distant nights, strangers' eyes lingering too long when she carried supplies through town. She told Thomas once, voice low as twilight, "They will not forgive us for surviving." He touched her hand and replied, "Then let's not waste our lives seeking forgiveness we don't need." His words were steady, but she could see the soldier's shadow in his eyes, the one that had survived battles by never underestimating the next fight. The night they came was cloaked in storm and fire. 6 riders, faces hidden behind kerchiefs, though their voices betrayed them, drew up to the fence line with torches burning like false stars. The cattle lowed in fear, the barn horses stamped and screamed. Thomas reached for his rifle, already dressed for battle, before Astrid could speak. "Stay inside," he whispered, but Astrid's reply was iron. "No, they came for both of us. They'll face both of us." She stepped through the doorway, her vast frame filling it until the flames of the torches wavered as though the fire itself trembled. The horses shied back from her silhouette, sensing the raw force of her presence. The mare sneered from the saddle, bold in his hatred. "You're not a woman. You're a beast. And no man alive can survive lying beside you." Astrid's voice rolled across the night like thunder. "I have a name, and I have a husband who still breathes." Her words silenced the jeering for a heartbeat, but then one of the masked men shouted, "We could burn you out! Burn the curse from this land!" Thomas stepped forward, rifle in hand, but not yet raised. His voice was calm, but every word struck like stone. "First good night's sleep I've had in 10 years was in her arms. First day I didn't think of putting a bullet in my mouth was the day she walked beside me. You want to save me from happiness? You'll have to kill me first." The riders shifted uneasily. The undertone of truth in his voice was not something they could dismiss. Astrid's hand closed around a porch beam, thick as a man's torso, and with barely a squeeze the wood groaned, splintered, cracked under her grip. "I could kill you all with these hands," she said, her voice steady, sorrowful. "But my husband taught me something stronger than strength. Mercy." She let the shattered beam fall with a thud that echoed into the men's bones. "Come again, threaten him again, and you will learn where mercy ends." Silence blanketed the night until one rider, the youngest among them, tore the kerchief from his face. His voice cracked as he spoke. "This is wrong. I've seen them in town. I've seen how they look at each other. That's not witchcraft. That's love. And if we destroy that, then we're the monsters." His horse turned, hooves drumming into the night. One by one, others followed, peeling away from the darkness. Only the mare and one hardened hand remained, their hatred sour and hollow. Thomas levelled the rifle now, his stance unshaken. "Leave," he said, "or die here. I will not warn you twice." For a moment the mare's pride warred with his fear. But the sight of Astrid towering beside her husband, unbowed, made even his venom falter. With a curse spat into the dirt, he wheeled his horse and vanished into the storm. The yard fell silent again, save for the pounding of rain. Astrid sank heavily onto the porch bench, the wood groaning under her weight. Thomas sat beside her, his hand seeking hers, despite the difference in scale. "They'll be back," she whispered, sorrow threading her strength. "And maybe I should leave, give you your life back." Thomas turned to her so quickly he nearly toppled from the bench. His voice broke open, fierce and raw. "My life back. Astrid, you are my life. Before you, I was already dead. Now, for the first time, I am fighting to live." "Don't you dare take that from me!" His words struck through her fear, filling the hollow places with warmth that healed deeper than any touch. For a long moment, They sat together, watching the storm recede into the horizon, the night settling into uneasy calm. Then Astrid's hand slid to her stomach, her voice barely audible. "Thomas, I'm pregnant." The words were lightning in the dark, both terror and miracle, promise and threat. Thomas's breath caught, his eyes wide with disbelief and wonder. He reached for her hand, covering it with both of his. "Good," he whispered, voice thick with awe. "Good. The world needs more of you." Her tears fell freely now, a torrent as unstoppable as the rain. "What if the child is like me? Too much? Too strong?" "Then we will love it," Thomas said, pressing his forehead to hers. "Exactly as it is. Like I love you. Like you are learning to love yourself." And as the storm softened into dawn, they sat together with their secret, a seed of hope cradled between fear and love, fragile and immense, already changing everything. Winter crept over the land with a quiet ferocity, draping the ranch in white silence, the wind cutting sharp through every crack of the cabin. Astrid's belly had grown vast, carrying the weight of new life like a mountain beneath her skin, and each step she took through the small house was measured and slow, as if the walls themselves strained to contain her. Thomas built stronger chairs, widened door frames, and reinforced the bed once again, his hands moving with urgency, born not of fear, but of love. Every nail he hammered, every plank he shaped, was an offering, proof that he would do everything within his mortal reach to make space for her and the child they had made together. Astrid often sat in her iron-braced rocking chair, needles of steel bent into tools that could withstand her touch, practicing the delicate art of knitting. Her hands, which once split wood and bent horseshoes, trembled as they worked yarn into imperfect stitches. She was not making cloth for herself, but for the child that kicked fiercely within her, each flutter a reminder that she carried something extraordinary, something the world had not yet learned to believe in. Sometimes she would sigh, her gaze distant, and whisper, "What if she is too big, too strong? What if she does not belong?" And Thomas, kneeling before her with calloused fingers stroking the swell of her stomach, would answer, "Then we will love her even more, because she will carry in her body the same truth you carry in yours. That strength is not a curse, it is a gift." There were nights when fear still clawed at Astrid, whispering that birth itself might claim her life, that her body could break under the very miracle it carried. On those nights, Thomas held her close, whispering into her skin stories of survival, how he had endured bullets, fire and fever, how he had walked through battlefields and come out breathing, and how none of it had prepared him for the simple, overwhelming healing of hearing her heartbeat beside his. "We are not cursed," he told her again and again, as though the words themselves were a shield. "We are chosen, chosen to show that love does not bow to fear." Yet beyond their walls, fear grew louder. Mayor Garrison gathered bitter men from nearby towns, his voice rising in saloons and barns, warning that Astrid's child would be an abomination, a danger to them all. Envy twisted his words into threats. The townsfolk who once whispered now debated openly, some declaring that Thomas must be saved from his wife, others beginning to stand in quiet defiance, unwilling to see cruelty triumph over love. A line was being drawn, one that would soon bring fire to their very door. One snow-heavy evening, a knock rattled the cabin. The doctor, his coat dusted white, entered with news grim as frost. "They're gathering, Thomas. 20. maybe more. They'll come tonight under the cover of storm. They say it's to free you, but it's not freedom they bring. It's fire." Astrid, her massive hand resting on her swollen belly, stood with difficulty, eyes dark with fury. "Then let them come," she said, her voice low thunder. But Thomas placed his hand over hers and shook his head. "Not with the child so close. We cannot fight fire with fire. We must show them something they cannot destroy." Astrid's lips parted in disbelief. "You would open our doors to men who hate us?" His gaze softened, but his tone was firm. "Yes, because love is not defended with rifles and torches, Astrid. It is defended with truth. If we fight them, they will see only monsters. But if we show them what we are building, they will have to face their own fear." The storm outside thickened, snow howling across the prairie like a beast. Inside, Astrid lowered herself into the chair, her knitting slipping from her lap, contractions tightening around her like an early summons. Thomas took her hand, kissed the rough knuckles that had carried so much sorrow, and whispered, "Then tonight the world will see not a curse, not a beast, but a mother and a child. Tonight, Astrid, we will not hide." And as the torches of 20 riders flickered in the distance, growing nearer through the storm, the cabin stood not as a fortress of war, but as a beacon of light and warmth, its door waiting to be opened, not to violence, but to truth. Dawn did not come quietly that winter. It came in fierce colors of rose and fire, spilling across the snow-draped prairie like a blessing after war. Within the cabin, the air still smelled of storm and new life, of sweat and tears mingled with the cries of a child too big for the world, yet born into it anyway. Grace lay nestled in her cradle of iron and wood, her fists already strong enough to rattle the bars, her grey eyes wide and watchful like storm clouds studying the earth. Astrid, pale and trembling with exhaustion, leaned back in the reinforced bed, her enormous hand resting protectively toward the cradle, even in sleep. Beside her, Thomas sat awake, eyes red, not from battle or grief, but from awe, as though he had been given something he had never dared to pray for. He lifted Grace into his arms, her weight closer to a child months older than a newborn, and held her against his chest. She stilled immediately, listening to his heartbeat, as if she already knew this sound would anchor her to the world. "Your mamma saved me," he whispered into her downy hair. "Before her, I was nothing but a ghost, moving through days without color. She woke me, taught me that strength is not a curse, and love is not meant to be survived, but lived." Grace gurgled, her tiny yet powerful fingers tugging at his beard, and Thomas laughed softly, a laugh so new it seemed to heal every scar inside him. The town, once filled with whispers of curses and bets on death, had begun to change. Neighbors who once turned away now gathered with offerings, wood, food, words of support. Even the preacher, whose voice had quivered at their vows, returned with a bowed head and prayers not against them, but for them. The doctor visited daily, astonished by the vitality of both mother and child, muttering that nothing in his books could explain such survival, such thriving. Astrid smiled at him one afternoon, her voice gentle as snowfall. Perhaps not everything worth living can be explained. And the doctor, humbled, could only nod. In the evenings, when the hearth burned bright and the shadows grew long, Astrid and Thomas would sit together, Grace cradled between them, and speak of the future they once thought impossible. They spoke of rebuilding the barn, of planting seeds when spring returned, of raising a child who would never need to hide her strength. Astrid still carried fear, deep as old roots, that her love could destroy, but each night when Thomas kissed her scars and whispered, "You are exactly enough," the fear loosened its hold. Healing was not sudden. It was steady, like the patient growth of a tree, like snow melting into rivers, like laughter learning to return after silence. One night, as Grace slept and the world outside was wrapped in white, Astrid leaned against Thomas, her head bowed over his shoulder. "Do you think they will ever stop fearing us?" she asked softly. Thomas pressed his lips to her temple, his smile warm. "They don't need to. Fear fades slower than love, but love endures longer. In time, they'll see what I see. Not a monster, not a curse, but the greatest blessing this world ever gave me." Astrid closed her eyes, tears slipping free, not of grief, but of gratitude. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to rest in peace, knowing she was cherished. Grace stirred in her cradle, her little cry filling the cabin like a bell calling them both to rise. Astrid moved first, though her body still ached, and Thomas steadied her with hands that promised she would never carry any burden alone again. They lifted their daughter together, marveling at her impossible weight, and in that shared act they saw not fragility but a future, strong, unshakable, and filled with love. The world had told them their union was doomed, that no man could survive her, that no love could grow from fear. And yet, here they were, a scarred man who had found his heartbeat again, a giant woman who had learned her strength was not a curse but a gift, and a child named Grace who embodied everything healing, everything miraculous, everything true. Their story was never meant to exist, but it did. And in its existence, it whispered to every lonely heart, every soul who had been told they were too much or not enough. Love is stronger than fear, always has been, always will be. If these words have touched you, if you believe as they did that impossible love is worth holding on to, let your heart answer. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, let others know that love in every form deserves to be seen. Like this story, if it warmed something inside you, subscribe if you wish to walk with us through more tales of healing and devotion. Because sometimes the love the world fears most is the very love that heals it, and your voice, your presence, keeps that truth alive.